Yeah, okay then. So, as I say, this is the final plenary. As I said to you this morning, you know, when we did the first plenary, I thought that was a really nice way of presenting some of the work of some of our best scholars here in the CCDS. And I think that set the day up really nicely. I'm sure you all agree. And since then, obviously, we've been to our various focus panels, which were very difficult to choose from. I would have certainly been happy to go to any of them. And so that's, you know, obviously always the downside, isn't it, of this sort of event. It's fair to say that when the papers came in, when the proposals came in, you know, there was a bit of a commonality in many of them in relation to blindness. And obviously I've done some work in that area myself, so it's a particular interest. I like to laugh, at least two people have read the stuff. Yeah, so obviously it's of particular interest. And it's what's always struck me is the way it goes in so many different directions, this work. In fact, I did a book, or I was involved in a book earlier this year called Finding Blindness. I can't even remember how many chapters are in there. I think it was 16 chapters. And you know, literally they all went in different directions. And I know some people here were involved in that book. I won't open that up now, that's just an example. But this final plenary is following in that theme, in the sense of, you know, where blindness takes us, you know. So, for example, in the case of Rod and Dan, who we all know very well, they've done a book together, which will be coming out, I believe, in September. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So this will be coming out in September, and that's going to be obviously a really interesting read for all of us. And I think what it starts to capture is, whereas the first plenary was about, you know, CCDS colleagues as in core members, the CCDS obviously is about engaging with colleagues around the world of you know, similar interests, as it were, and I think this plenary is going to capture that nicely, with in part because of the work of Rod and Dan, because both of those have been so many times and been involved so many times with this work. And the other thing to say is, you know, in the academy, especially in the UK, perhaps. Books are not always sort of embraced in the way you might imagine, or the way I'd like to imagine. You know, it's really, you're expected to do papers, probably because you can pump them out more and so on. Dan's probably got a better idea than me on this, but you know, it seems a shame to me, because I like the engagement with stuff at length. I think the word self-indulgent was used earlier. I like that. And that's the sort of, you know, that extended study is what I've always been very fond of. And that's one of the things that obviously we're going to capture in this final plenary, like we did in the first one, that these are extended studies. So the first one that we're going to turn to is actually another CCDS core member, and this is Professor Claire Penketh, who we've already met and has always been very involved in the CCDS, and today's no exception. And this is, I remember talking to Claire about this work many years ago. I almost want to say 10 years ago. It's probably not quite that long ago. But yeah, I didn't mean to imply that. But we often had conversations, and this phrase ocularnormativity would come up. Usually she would be talking about something, I'd say, yeah, ocularnormativity, that is, and try to get in there, like, you know. So I think eventually she agreed that, yeah, it might well be a starting point. And I think that's what I'm suggesting here, that was one of the starting points of this book that Claire's going to be talking to us now. So maybe you can show your appreciation for Professor Claire Penketh.
So, right, okay, we've got a piece of, there's a piece of knitting involved in this presentation. It's a history of disability and art education. Performed as the unravelling of a knitting pattern, aka it seemed a good idea at the time. As I've just mentioned this to David, I could hear him thinking like, oh no, just read the stuff, just talk about the book, but it'll be evident. So I've got a piece of knitting. This was my rehearsal piece So as I've rehearsed the talk, I've knitted, and what I'm going to do now is to unravel my knitting. I'm assisted by Erin, who's going to, you know, she's going to get that into a nice ball of wool by the end of it. So, without further ado, so let me just, is my 20 minutes starting now? I'm going to do a Tanya and go, I'm going to go over by, how many? I'm not going to go over. Okay, so the image included in the opening slide here represents a practice-based response to early archival work for a forthcoming book, A History of Disability and Art Education. For the purposes of this presentation, it reflects the metaphorical interlacing of theoretical perspectives from disability studies with histories of educational and institutional practices in art, craft and design, in an attempt to retrieve disability as a dropped stitch or a hole in established historical accounts of art education. The image here shows a knitted piece based loosely on an archival photograph of a plaster cast of the brain and cortex of Laura Bridgman, pupil and later teacher at Perkins School for the Blind, who following her early death in 1889 became the object of scientific study. Laura Bridgman entered Perkins School at the age of 7 after losing her sight and hearing, a consequence of childhood illness. Her ability to learn to read and write brought fame for her and the school director, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was able to demonstrate the effectiveness of his methods as he worked with her directly fingerspelling into her palm. Kimberly French, in her History of Perkins School, includes a photograph of a piece of Bridgman's delicate lacework, explaining that Laura's mother had taught her to knit before she became a student at Perkins. Although Bridgman is represented as largely incapable of communicating prior to her time at school, there must have been sufficient interaction with her mother or other family member for her to learn to sew and knit. This form of familial education and her undoubted ability to learn through and with materials, as well as her family's ability to teach through these forms, is passed over in a narrative that prioritises the role of the school in bringing Laura into a literate world. Where Blindness Takes Us, in this case, is to the beginning of the book, Casting On. Every mark counts. Value is at the heart of this project, the value we attribute to art education and the differential value attributed to disabled people in past and present times. The significance we place on subjects, people as well as curricula, can lead to their elevation or disqualification, their celebration or avoidance, their preservation or ruin. Whilst art education may have had a long association with inclusivity, its histories have left disability as a marginal or special interest. This isn't part of the performance, I'm just having a quick drink. Sorry about that, was it? It was the best bit. Somebody said it was the best bit. Keep that bit in next time you do it. I explore a number of reasons for its omission, including critical avoidance, the perceived irrelevance of disability, the dominance of needs-based discourse, the fragmentation of hierarchical histories and linguistic variations. In particular, I highlight the continued absence of disability in the light of contemporary revisionist histories of art education. We might argue that creative practices inherent in art education can resist taken for granted assumptions about what bodies and minds can be and do. Yet education is determined by cultural and societal preferences that prioritise those with so-called typical bodies and minds. Art education is not immune to such presumptions, since it too can reproduce and reinforce normative and ableist practices. In part, this is a consequence of educational systems that are as hostile to the subject of art education as the individuals it excludes. Yet ableist assumptions are embedded in creative as well as institutional practices, exclusions that are illustrated and reproduced by the absence of critical perspectives on disability in its histories. The book is in two parts, and offers a sustained, if very partial, exploration of the relationship between disability and art education, revisiting past intersections in order to reflect on its contemporary and future relevance. Knit 1. Work for 5 chapters. 1. Crafting ocular normativity. That's why I didn't want to use that term, David, because I can't say it. Crafting ocular normativity, the dominance of vision, recognises the particular influence of industrial capitalism on the establishment of educational structures and processes in art education during the 1800s. More specifically, it examines the dominance of particular ideas about vision and visuality. Ocular normativity is employed here as a key concept to support a reading of 2 key texts. The first, Pioneers and Perseverance, Michael Royden's History of the Royal School for the Blind, here in Liverpool, and the Perkins School for the Blind, a book by Kimberly French. A main argument centres on the combined effects of ocular normativity and the emergence of new literacy practices that have contributed to a hierarchical relationship between design, fine art and craft. The chapter discusses the priority of vision over blindness, fine art over craft, and the supremacy of literacy in evolving systems of education. 2. Curating deafness. Aesthetics and the politics of display explores the dominance of normative ideas regarding beauty, goodness and taste. The discussion here centres on the collective exhibit of Schools for the Deaf at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, which showcased the role that the visual and mechanical arts played for children who were deaf. Whilst evidencing their segregation and supposed rehabilitation, the exhibition offered a mediated space for contact, positioning art educators and their pupils as actors within our histories of art education. However, the particular emphasis on the civilizing role of the arts for so-called savage races of Indigenous Americans and deaf children prompts an alternate reading of the moral purpose of an aesthetic art education at this time. 3. Erasing identity, eugenics and IQ. This explores the relationship between art education, disability and a eugenic logic. Eugenics had a significant influence on British culture, with keen support from numerous artists, writers and intellectuals in the early 1900s. While the turn of the century brought the prospect of universal access to art education, it did so within the context of exclusion, since a eugenic logic created a rationale for the segregation of children classified as feeble-minded. The concept of universality, so widely cited in previous histories of art education, refers instead then to a partial inclusion and one which prioritised apparently typical cognitive abilities. This narrative of a universal art education therefore confirms an act of erasure. Accounts at the turn of the century show a subject struggling to maintain its status within the curriculum, yet institutional practices in the arts appear to offer a means of redemption, humanising those otherwise disqualified on the grounds of their perceived cognitive incapacity. 4. A belief in the artistic capabilities of children is pursued in a further chapter, Child Art, the Making of Normative Youth. This explores the enduring influence of child art and the child art movement in the early 1900s and questions its contribution to a normative concept of childhood. Whilst accounts celebrate the child's early years as a time for individual creative expression, histories of segregated education reflect a preoccupation with functional development of the disabled child in preparation for a productive future. Such historical accounts contribute to the reinforcement of ableist assumptions regarding what it means to be a child, potentially obscuring disabled childhoods. The chapter draws on 2 examples, the Heritage Craft School in Chailey, East Sussex, and the Oscar Helene Home in Berlin, Germany, in order to examine the normative divide between creative individual expression in art and the utility of craft education for physically impaired children. 5. Psychology. Troubling the art education therapy nexus. This recognises the significant influence of psychology on art education and disability. While psychology suggests a wide field, in particular application to child study and the emergence of child-centred pedagogies in the early 20th century makes this a central preoccupation in histories of art education. Psychological methods were fundamental to the identification of age-related drawing schema, for example, developed in Britain by James Sully. I take a line from his early investigations in the 19th century through to the application of psychology to art education in the mid-20th century by Victor Lowenfeld, offering a discussion of his psychological explorations of haptic and visual types in research involving visually impaired young people. I move then to Lowenfeld's later work, which extolled the virtues of art education therapy for disabled young adults. Here I examine the role of psychology in the production of normalising discourses in art education. I argue, however, that a more nuanced reading of Lowenfeld's work reflects his capacity to learn from disability. Part 2. Reduce stitches, knit two together, knit two for 3 chapters. Part 2 opens with containing curricula, regulation and agency, an examination of curriculum, regulation and assessment in England in the 1980s. Attempts to defend and redefine art education reflected a knowledge of models from the past, its contemporary relevance and an openness to future uncertainty. Whilst there were concerns regarding the structural limitations imposed by a new national curriculum, advocates pointed towards a localised power of practice where art teachers could at last exert agency. I argue that these representations of art education characterise a subject poised to embrace a social orientation towards disability that was advocated by US art educator Doug Blandy. However, the introduction of a single category of special educational needs in Britain reinforced a needs rather than rights-based approach, rendering critical perspectives on disability as peripheral to curriculum revisions at that time. 7. Inclusive education. Displacing contemporary art practice. Discusses international objectives for social, educational and political change. A move towards inclusive education challenged the segregation of children and young people whilst promoting a more diverse teaching body. This chapter therefore brings a reading of inclusion together with arguments for bringing contemporary art practice into school art education via the role of the artist teacher. It offers examples from John Darby and J.T. Eisenhower, disabled people as artist teachers who provoke alternate renderings of mental disability through autopathography and autoethnographic practice. The chapter examines the potential for a unification of contemporary art practice with learner and teacher identities that have been marked as excessive to school. 8. Crisis and precarity, austere times for disability and art education, examine the period between 2010 and 2020. Beginning with the emergence of the coalition government in Britain, it outlines the politics of austerity and the resulting precarity of disability and art education. The hostility experienced by education, and more specifically arts-based subjects, position them as excessive to an academic curriculum underpinned by an emphasis on STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths. In addition to this, new training and management models in secondary schools in Britain reduce teacher autonomy and agency, making curriculum innovation and a deep understanding of pedagogy in art, craft and design appear as irrelevant. During these recent times, the lives of disabled people were worsened by political ideologies that continued to demonise those deemed to be unproductive. In particular, disabled children and young people were disproportionately impacted by cuts to provision, including educational support. In moving towards the EBAC, the English Baccalaureate, art education and pupils labelled with special educational needs became excessive to schools who were required to justify particular forms of academic performance within a highly competitive and regulated sector. Casting off. Advancing an anti-ableist pedagogy. Disabled and non-disabled artists, activists and academics and students demand innovative pedagogy and curriculum in art education. Aligning disability arts with contemporary arts practice enables the radical revisioning of individual and deficit-based ideologies. Such perspectives are underpinned by an ethical and moral commitment to valuing diverse human capacities for what they can teach us about learning. And I'm referencing some work by Dennis Atkinson in his work on a pedagogy of care. In a final word, I ask, what optimism is available, and how can a relationship between art education and disability foster hope? I find it here, where the alliance between disability studies and art education offers an essential reminder that we must value our ability to make good, and to believe that every mark counts. Cast off tightly using number 11 needles. Fasten off securely. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. We don't have knitting or embroidery or anything, so we're not going to be as good. Anyway, I want to once more thank David and Claire and all the others who put this conference together. It's been incredible. Even the lunch was great. Isn't that great? Well, don't applaud or anything. Be serious. Just sit there and be tired. Okay. Wasn't the lunch great?
Yes! What'd you have?
Depends if you're at the front of the queue or not.
Ah, there you go. There you go. Anyway, thanks so much, and thanks for giving Dan and I this opportunity to talk a little bit about our book coming out in September. And we promised not to take too much of our time so that we can, this has been a very, very long day, and as David said, a lot of great sessions and great papers. So I'm just turn it over to Dan to start a little session off.
Okay, yeah, this is short and sweet, hopefully. You'll be pleased to know. So, thanks to the conference for the chance to say a few words about Letters with Smokey, Blindness and More Than Human Relations by Michalko. Round of applause, come on now. And Dan Goodley. This is where the applause will end, my friend. Right. So what we want to do first is to say some words from the blurb. I'll read. Letters with Smokey, Blindness and More Than Human Relations. Leave it to a dog to pull the human back into humanities. In September 2020, Rod wrote to friend and colleague Dan, congratulating him on the release of his latest book, Disability and Other Human Questions, joking that his late guide dog Smokey had taken offence to the suggestion that disability was purely a human question. Michalko shared a few thoughts on behalf of his dog. When Goodley wrote back to Smokey, so began an apostolic exchange that will continue for the next 7 months. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world and the realities of lockdown imposed isolation set in, the Smokey letters provided the friends a space, more than a space I think, in which to come together in a lively exploration of human-animal relations and to interrogate disability as disruption, disturbance, art, and just as he did in life, Smokey guides. In these pages, he offers wisdom about the world, love and friendship, and even the Beatles. This was meant to be here, folks. This His canine observations of human experience provide an avenue into some of the ways blindness might be reconceptualized and befriended. Pretty good blur, what do you think? Okay. Okay, now in the second half of this talk, see what I did there? I'm sure it's going to be short. Trying to butter up to the crowd, that was pretty good, I thought. Thank you. Now in the second part of this brief talk, we'd like to share with you some comments from one of the reviewers of the original manuscript. Now it's very important that you all in this room know that we received some brilliant reviews. I mean, brilliant doesn't even capture how great these reviews. Granted, one of them was written by my mum, but that's not important right. Well, then we got Reviewer C's comment. Reviewer C. Fucking. So, we're going to read out 5 comments from Reviewer C, and we're going to respond. That's saying we mainly Rod's going to respond.
I have no idea.
And this could kill the book, but we'll see. Okay, so email sent from the editor on the 17th of June, 2022. Hi, Rod and Dan. Notice how informal they are in Canada, by the way. Hi. We have our 3rd report, and I'm very glad that we have the others. Still, I think Reader C's report is useful in that it points to some areas where the manuscript could be more robust to head off similar criticism after publication. Feel free to respond to this Reviewer C separately. Are you ready? Yeah. Reviewer C, and I will read from Reviewer C. I was thinking about putting on a voice for them, but I have carefully reviewed and considered this work. It is a rather unusual idea of a dead dog writing letters with a friend of its former owner who the dog did not know in a previous life. The premise is hard to believe. And the book does not convince me that this is a good vehicle to discuss issues in disability studies. I have therefore come to the conclusion that it makes no contribution to the field, and I do not recommend it for publication. The book would not appeal to experts in disability studies like myself. And there are many reasons for this. We only have time to look at 5. Okay, specific comment number 1. The book is very self-absorbed and refers to the relationships that the reader has nothing to do with, nor is interested in knowing about. The letter writers often praise each other and the people that they relate with in their families. When reading the book, the reader feels left out. Rod, your response.
Should we keep these people up? Well, it's one of those things that the book started off. It wasn't intended as a book. I just did it as the person from the university press said. It was kind of a joke, and it was of a disability, other human questions. So I just said that Smokey had some responses. Smokey, the name of my late guide dog, and he just basically said, and tried to be funny. He did. Saying to Dan, what do you mean, disability and other human questions? I dragged the blind guy around for most of my adult life, and I know a lot about disability, especially blindness. So it started off that way. We were just writing letters back and forth, not intended at all. It just so happened I had mentioned it to an acquisitions editor at the University of Toronto Press, and she wanted to look at it, and she said she loved it and wanted to publish it. We just didn't intend it as a book. So it's true. It is really true. It's hard to believe that you could have a dead dog, which I took a little bit of offense to. Smokey doesn't know often. I don't know if I think of it as a dead dog, but I suppose. And I think it's difficult to imagine writing a book or anything else where self-absorption is a part of it. I mean, as David mentioned earlier, a longer thing like a book does involve some self-indulging, and it does involve an involvement in opposite an absorption of the self. Secondly, they are letters. There were letters back and forth about things that Dan and I experienced and knew. So they were between us, and I was sort of happy that we did exclude that reader C. I'm glad he felt not part of the text. So I think it'll be good to launch this book at the Hard Day's Night Hotel.
Okay, well you say all that, Rod, but what about specific comment 2? I'll read it out. Specific comment 2. The book discusses very few disability studies theories. There are some promising forays into the dog as an aid to a blind person. However, in conversations with blind colleagues through the years, They have said to me that the guide dog is a mere technical aid and is viewed as working in that role, not as a friend. End comment. Rodders?
Yeah, I suppose we spoke about disability in this conference over a number of years, at least 6 that I've been here, and about blindness sometimes, especially this session. And we spoke about it as a relation. A lot of people talked about a relational model and things like that. Blindness is always a relation to ellipsis, whatever, sight, everything else. Understanding blindness as a technical problem requiring a technical solution is certainly one way to relate to blindness. It is one way to relate to human beings and to being human. So a refrigerator, for example, is a technical solution to a technical problem that we humans have with keeping food chilled and cold. There's all sorts of things that we do and invent technology to do. It doesn't mean that that's humanity or the end of being human. So Smokey, my guide dog, was much more than a technical solution to a technical problem, insofar as I didn't view my blindness as a technical problem any more than those of you who view your sight as a technical problem, even though you have a shitload of technical solutions to your problem. You have more accommodations than we blind people have. The lighting, for instance, in this building costs a fortune. Nobody says it's difficult to accommodate those sighted people, it's too expensive. Not a soul. You have got more accommodations in sighted people than blind people could ever have. Those of us who don't use wheelchairs, look at all the chairs provided for those of us who don't have those things. That's a whole lot of money provided for able-bodied people. So, no. Blindness is not merely a technical problem. Who is this reader? I know who.
We should have ended the comment there. Okay, specific comment 3. A case is not made for learning about the dog from his point of view. If the book had been a discussion between the blind person and a friend about disability issues, that would have worked better. So I'm going to take this one. Okay. So I think Smokey in the book is pretty open about himself. And I think, like us all, he makes some choices about what he shares and holds back some stories that he doesn't want to share. We don't, for example, hear about his relationships with organised crime, his wild Toronto nights on ketamine, nor his Marxist activism in certain parts of Latin America. They are all idealisations, people. I think friendship is an interesting one, isn't it? The comment is saying, well, what about, I'd rather you talk about a friend. Well, friendship's an interesting one. True friends love each other. I'm convinced that Smokey and Rod definitely love one another, and they're probably more than friends. And I actually think that the readers could be convinced by this friendship if you want to frame it that way. And also I think in that comment is something quite interesting. There's all this stuff about post-human disabilities at the moment. But I'd like to challenge the implicit species bias in the comment that kind of suggests an animal can't be a friend. 3 weeks ago we lost our Florence Siamese cat. I've got to be honest with you, I'm still utterly broken by this. I find myself apologising when I tell people about this. Those people who have companion loves in their life totally get it, right? And I think this question about learning, I think the whole book is about what Rod and Smokey have learned together, or at least some things about what you've learned together. And also, crucially, how you've learned from one another. So, I think we can reject that comment outright too. Agreed? Right. Okay. Specific comment 4. I have to say this is one of my favourites. There is already one book out about the dog and Rod Michalko. I don't think there needs to be another one. Where do you go with the dog? Okay, Rod, does the world need another one?
Oh, God. Rod and Smokey, too. Yeah, I suppose that's true. It's in some ways you write one book and that's enough. So those of you in the room who've written more than one or are thinking of writing more than one, just stop, okay? Just stop. One is enough. You can, as everybody knows, you can talk about things in I think I just went off here. You can talk about things at a certain historical moment of your life and then we talk about them differently at a later time, and it's always, you know, you always got to develop ideas and such. So I don't know exactly what that meant. Yeah, there's probably way too much written in disability studies by Rod Michalko. I wouldn't read any of it personally. You know? I never really do. I think also, just to go back to the first comment 2 or 3, no 2, where the reviewer says that we don't discuss disability studies theory. The book is full of disability studies theory. We make fun of it, we discuss it, we cry about it, laugh about it. There's all kinds of things. We even talk, and I know this is kind of dangerous here in UK, we even talk about the, ready? Social model. Yeah, we do. So we talk about all sorts of things, post-human stuff and everything like that. But I think we'll buy it anyway, even if it's the second book. Okay?
Okay, you will please, sir. This is the final comment. We're going to go and give our final response to it. Thank you for perseverance. Okay, the final comment is also a particular favourite of ours. Okay, so I'll read this out. There are in-jokes in this book, such as the argument around who is the best Beatle. I, as a reader, do not feel included here, and I like the Beatles. So we'd like to respond to this one. For those young people in the room, the Beatles were a band in the 1960s that essentially changed popular culture, and not just people who wrote songs that appeared on Glee. So it's important to make that point here, particularly obviously in Liverpool. So I'm going to respond to this, the best Beatle, first, and then I'm going to hand over to Rod, who can give your views, and you can wrap up this thing. Okay, so clearly the best Beatle people is Paul McCartney. Don't think of Paul McCartney now, and what you're all going to do. Paul McCartney was essentially the revolutionary, the creative heartbeat of the Beatles, and John Lennon was a hack. Oh yes, well, see, now you're interested. What's it controversial bullshit is that? Okay, I'm going to finish, we're going to finish on by, Roger, you're going to finish on the best Beatle.
Yeah, I think without John, the Beatles would just have been ills. They wouldn't have been the Beatles. They're just ill. And of course, John was the best Beatle. And here's a heartbreaking thing. Tanya and I are staying at the Hard Day's Night Hotel, and we have a Paul McCartney room. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope everybody really enjoyed this talk.
Some noise.
Okay, folks, we've just got another 5 minutes or so, so just bear with us. Really, I do want to obviously just say thanks to everyone for coming. It's been a really good event and lots of great papers, and you know, being as it was only for a day, I wasn't quite sure how well received that would be, so I really appreciate the fact that people have come such a long way, so many people come such a long way to show their support and input to this work that we all find so important still. I was going to just ask if anyone might have any questions for any of our plenaries. And when I say any, I mean from this morning or for now. We'll have to keep this relatively short, but we do have a few minutes to do this. So I just wonder if we've got a roaming mic that we can use.
Yeah, I've got the mic.
Yeah, so we might need somebody to sort of walk around with. Yeah, yeah. And then do we have a mic up here still?
There's a comment at the back already.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll do what we can here. Like I say, it's going to be relatively short, but it would be a shame to miss this opportunity. And if you could say who you are, even if you're famous.
I promise my guide dog is more famous today than me. But first of all, thank you so much for the panels today during the conference. This is my first disability studies conference that I come to. I wanted to ask Rod and Dan, when the book is coming out in September, as a guide dog user, I'm really interested to read the book because I think a lot of people can learn from guide dog users through their experience, but also through a book written by their guide dog's experience as well. Yeah.
Just to say that both the books that we've talked about last, Claire's and Dan and Rod's are coming out in September. Is that right?
Yeah.
So all of those will be available. Certainly our library will be ordering both of them, irrespective of what, what was it? No, Reviewer C. What, I mean, it's so professional, isn't it, though, that no one shouted out the name of who that is likely to be, you know. But anyway, we'll keep it that way. Yeah, we have our suspicions, I'm sure. But I think I'll answer that question just to save the manoeuvre of the mic. So we'll go on to the next question, if that's okay. Anyone else? Again, identify yourself, if you will, please.
I have a shout out. I'm raising my loud voice.
Yeah, hold on. Someone's coming. We've all got loud voices.
I have a text message from Rosemary Garland Thompson sending her love. I've been reporting to her about how she's being cited chapter and verse here in the Bible. So I just wanted to let everyone
that is
know
nice.
she sends her love.
Yeah, and fair play. Rosemary Garland Thompson's been here a few times. As I said earlier, one of the nicest parts about doing this conference is when we get people coming back, you know, because it's one of my sort of new pet hates. Yeah, I've got quite a few. But it's where people sort of get involved in disability studies and then seem to leave it when they start to get promoted and so on. I call them stepping stoners. And obviously the people here clearly are not stepping stoners because they keep coming back and they keep submitting to the journal, the book series and everything. It's so good to have sustained work and colleagues who are dedicated to this. So yeah, that was a nice thing to share. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to draw it in there because... Okay, sorry.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I hope you don't mind me disagreeing. The best Beatle is George Harrison.
Okay. And I think... well, I seem to be falling in the chair for a moment, so I can only say, has anyone ever heard of, you know, Jackanory or any of these things that were done so well by the drummer? Yes, that was my joke. It didn't really work, did it, that joke? So, sorry. Anyway, I knew I should have stopped earlier. Okay, then, I'm going to stop it there just because it has been a long day for a lot of us, and I know lots of you travelled in. I had to cross the road this morning, that's all. But so I do, like I say, many thanks to all of you. I did an official thanks, if you noticed at the beginning of the catalogue, so I just made sure that key people were named. Just to add on to that, I know that Lauren, our administrator, brought extra administrators who weren't named because I didn't know they were coming. So I think that was Lindsay and Karen, is that right? So thanks to them as well. Also, special thanks to anyone who read a paper on behalf of someone else. I'll probably forget someone, but I would like to mention these people. So I know Tanya did. I know that Manal did. I know that Helen did, who didn't even know she was coming until I think yesterday or so. So Helen is one of our doctoral students, and she came in and read a paper on behalf of someone else, which, you know, obviously is much appreciated. Did Emma read one as well in the end? Emma Sway, but you were willing to, and likewise Ria Cheen, Dr. Cheen was ready to do that on behalf of her panel. We couldn't organise that, unfortunately, but that was certainly not Ria's fault. She was keen to help that. But I always think that's quite tricky to read on behalf of somebody else in that way, so it's much appreciated the things that people have done to keep the conference going. I did hear that lunchtime didn't go well for everybody. I have spoke to a few people and they said it was great, but apparently that's if you were at the front of the queue. It has been raised, and I know that Suzanne will have a word about that. So sorry if that affected anyone. I know we got the food sorted in the end, but I imagine you were rushed, so apologies for that. Mentioning Suzanne, those of you who've been sort of exchanging emails with me over the last 6 months or 4 months or so will know that Suzanne has been amazing, and Jamie too, but Suzanne always goes the extra mile, so you know I must extend those thanks, but I think I'll leave that there now because some of us are going to go to the pub, so there are lots of restaurants if you're that way inclined, folks, nearby, but some of us are going to go to the halfway house, so I'll be sitting at the back of there in about 10 minutes' time. Halfway House is on Walton Road. It's near to Eaton Place where we used to go. It's just a few doors down. So that's where some of us will go. But obviously there are quite a few nice places to eat round here. Okay, well, thanks, folks.